Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Francisco, and I'm the program manager of the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum. So welcome to the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum presented by TD, Day 3, where our discussion topic will be freedom of the press, the local, national, and international perspective. But before I go any further, I would like to introduce you to Ms. Carrie Scarlett, from branch manager of TD.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum. My name is Carrie Scarlett. I'm a branch manager at 93rd and Macleod here in Calgary with TD Canada Trust, and we're very proud to sponsor this event this week. Today's presentation is titled Freedom of the Press, the Local, National, and International Perspective. And this is TD's 9th year in supporting GlobalFest and the Human Rights Forum. Each year, the speakers and topics bring together an even more dynamic group of people to share experiences, knowledge, and solutions to bring about change and create positive and safe communities around our world. Thank you all for being here today. Now on to Brian to introduce all the speakers.
All right. As usual, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we are on Treaty 7 lands, the City of Calgary, the province of Alberta, as well as the federal government of Canada for allowing us to be here. So this morning, we had our breakfast event with our keynote, Mohammed Fahmy, titled Media in the Age of Terror, How the War on Terror Became a War on Journalism. With this being sort of a continuation of that topic, we are here to discuss the role of news media, or the long-vaunted Fourth Estate, as a societal, political, and instrumental force whose influence may not always be consistently or officially recognized. We're here to discuss how this power is wielded and how it has changed in a modern-day context of digital globalization. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Ms. Monika Zarowski. She's been a journalist and author for more than 2 decades, as well as the recipient of numerous journalism awards, including 7 national awards from the Canadian Newspaper Association. She is the deputy editor of the Calgary Herald. So please give her a warm welcome. And the first of our panelists, Mr. Mohammed Fahmy. He's an award-winning Egyptian-Canadian journalist and author who has spent the most of his career covering conflict zones and some of the most definitive global events that shape our world today. He has reported for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Dubai TV, Al Hurra, and CNN, in addition to working 2 years with the International Red Cross. Our next panelist is Ms. Asha Siad. She is an award-winning Somali-Canadian journalist and documentary filmmaker who has reported for CBC News, Shaw TV, and Frontier. She has interviewed Somalian President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, as well as reported on the experiences of Indigenous youth in Canada. She has also received the Images and Voices of Hope Award of Appreciation for showing commitment to constructive change and amplifying hope through the media. And last but certainly not least, we have Miss Melanie Woods, the editor-in-chief of the Gauntlet, the independent student newspaper at the University of Calgary. She has worked for over 2 years as the Gauntlet's humor editor, with over 4 years total with the Gauntlet, covering various societal issues, including LGBTQ issues, as well as the ongoing legal battle between the University of Calgary and its student union over ownership of its student center. So after this discussion, we will be opening the floor to Q&A, as well as having a brief reception in the foyer of the John Dutton. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to our moderator and our panelists for some opening statements, and then get right into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for your great organization of getting a really interesting group of people together. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation, and I look forward to the portion of the afternoon where you get a chance to ask us some questions and we can hear what you're thinking as well. So thank you for that. As Brian mentioned, I'm the deputy editor at the Calgary Herald and Sun, and I guess when I wrote that bio, I was closer to two decades in the business. The years have passed now, it's closer to 3 decades. And so press freedom, it's interesting. Were any of you at the breakfast this morning with Mohammed Fahmy? A few of you? So he made a great statement this morning about how freedom is something that we often don't think about until we don't have it anymore. And I was thinking how that applies to me in my job. And certainly freedom of the press is something that can easily be taken for granted. We assume that we're going to be able to be free to report on whatever we like, as long as we do it within the libel laws, etc. of Canada, as long as we try to do it in a fair, accurate, balanced manner. So freedom of press can be something we take for granted until we hear stories about people who are unjustly imprisoned, for example, when that freedom isn't there anymore. So my stories about freedom of the press, though, are of a local nature in some sense. I mean, there is freedoms that are chipped away at on a weekly basis that I think we have to be vigilant in being aware of, and also in how we address them. One of the things I really see happening now in the age of digital journalism, and I love digital journalism allows us to, for example, at the Calgary Herald, when I started, we had our print readership, and so we would have 300,000 people, for example, looking at the newspaper on a daily basis. Well, now that the Calgary Herald is online, there can be 30 million people a month looking at the calgaryherald.com. So as a journalist, that's so exciting, and the opportunities to tell stories and to be thorough and in-depth at times, to be fast at times, is wonderful. So I love digital journalism. But something interesting is that digital journalism, of course, is open to anyone. Anyone can start a blog. Anyone can start writing whatever they want. And as a result, I think the role of press, whether that's a radio station, a TV station, a newspaper, it's really important because we still need these organizations who can hold the filter up to what's going on in the world. A lot of digital journalism, you see digital journalism now committed by every professional sports team, by every level of government. They're putting out their own news releases, they're putting out their own videos. They're controlling their message. In some ways that's great, but my concern, I guess, or one of the topics I often talk about is they're controlling that message, but who's asking the tough questions? Who's asking things like, who's behind this? Who's funding this? You still need that journalistic filter. And so press freedom, I think, in the new age of digital journalism is more important than ever. So that's just sort of where I would start with, and I'd like to just pass the imaginary mic over to you, because of course we're wearing mics, but feel free to jump in, Mohammed.
Well, it's been great coming back to Canada after my imprisonment. It's been 11 months since I've been free, and I've had more time. I look at myself when I first got out, my interviews, I was very charged and still not oriented, fully oriented as a free man. Now much calmer, and I'm seeing things in a different perspective. And it's very interesting because we talk about freedom of expression, and it's definitely a core part of any healthy democratic society. But when you look at the world today, it's not just a problem that's restricted to a certain area. It's a global problem. Of course, in Canada, we don't have an issue per se, but we have our concerns as journalists. Reporters Without Borders had issued a statement saying that Canada has gone down 10 points on the index in the past decade since Mr. Harper's tenure. And I look at countries like Egypt, Iran, and China, and Turkey, where there are major problems there. And I know there's about 200 journalists imprisoned worldwide as we speak, and many more have been killed, and we're talking about dozens. And the way I see it now is that because of this so-called war on terrorism, many countries are using these vague laws as almost as a license to kill and imprison. And we're seeing so many people, innocent people, falling in this trap and being labeled as terrorists or spies. And in fact, they're just doing their jobs on the ground, and it's becoming really hard to do your job as a journalist safely, and because of this situation. You're being targeted by governments and by Islamist extremists on the ground, almost leaving no neutral ground for us to operate freely. So I do believe that there should be more proactive ways of dealing with this issue. I was just in Geneva a couple of months ago, adding my voice to several organizations, including Canadians, Journalists for Freedom of Expression, Reporters Without Borders, and others. calling on the United Nations to assign a special envoy to deal with this specific file of imprisonment of journalists, because it's so complicated, and you need someone who has neutrality and someone to be able to intervene and speak with governments and try to extract the journalists or the human rights defenders who are being caught up in this situation and turmoil in the Middle East, for example. And that's just one idea that I hope could be implemented.
Excellent. And Asha, as a journalist who has worked both at home and abroad, making documentaries, what were some of your initial thoughts when you start thinking about freedom of the press?
Well, it's so interesting because, as an independent journalist and filmmaker, I've had the opportunity to share a lot of untold, underreported stories. And when Brian invited me to this event, I was preparing for it, and a few months ago I heard this topic really hit home for me, because 2 months ago I found out about a young Somali female journalist, Sagal Salat Osman, who was murdered outside of her university by 3 gunmen in Mogadishu, Somalia. And after I heard her story, I was heartbroken, because here I am as a young Somali female journalist in Canada, being able to report freely, being able to be a journalist, and that was not her reality. So just hearing about this topic and really thinking about the importance of it, because Somalia is one of the most dangerous countries for journalists to report in. So I'm hoping that this conversation today will help us go beyond this event to continue the conversation and to talk about this issue so that more journalists can report freely in the world today.
Excellent. And it's interesting in this panel that we're going to be able to talk about this perspective and this topic from an international, national, and local level. And certainly Melanie, as an editor at a local publication at the U of C, the Gauntlet, you experienced some of the press freedom issues on a very hyper-local level.
Yeah, I think the Gauntlet comes from, our entire mandate is to report incredibly hyper-locally. And so we exist independently of the university, of the Students' Union, of other institutions around there. And it is our job to kind of maintain access and objectivity under that huge umbrella of a lot of organizations that maybe don't want that. And so a lot of our time when it comes to access and whatnot comes in terms of being fair and objective within that institutional framework. And it's really interesting on a hyperlocal level, because of course we're not dealing necessarily with life and death situations as you often do abroad, but we are dealing with trying to, and as a student paper, educate our reporters and our editors in a way that says, you do have a right to be able to report freely, and you do have a right to have access to sources, and you do have a right to have access to information, and it's a student's right to be able to know that, and it's our job to give them that. And so it's really interesting. Again, when I got invited to this panel, I was a little intimidated at first. I was like, wow, big, important people, but we have a very unique perspective in terms of the hyper-locality of it all.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to add about, since we're in Calgary, when I came back, I heard of the case between Vice Canada and the RCMP. A very well-established reporter, Ben Micucci, had done an excellent job in tracking a former Calgary resident who joined jihad in Iraq, and he had conversations with him on Kickstarter, on the internet, and he did some great journalism. And I was really surprised that the RCMP, demanded the notes and started the case. And I met Ben in Ottawa by coincidence, and he was telling me, "I can't believe this is Canada." And I was like, "Yeah, me too. I just came from Egypt, and this sounds very familiar and very disturbing." So this is just one example of how, and someone who's not into journalism would ask me, why? What does that mean? Well, it's because, one, we don't do the jobs for the cops and the police, and two, it's because no one will ever trust the journalist again if we have to give our information and notes to the government. So that's one, example that caught my eye when I came back.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting. At the Herald last year, last September, we published a series about homegrown terrorism, and a young reporter, a great reporter named Dylan Robertson, spent up to a year researching homegrown terrorism in Canada, and he found young people in Calgary who had stories about what happens in Canada. They were suspected terrorists or potential terrorists, and this young man told Dylan how here in Calgary, he cannot go out go anywhere without being followed by anonymous people. And Dylan, as a journalist, thought, really? In Calgary? So the guy said, come on over, I'll show you. And so sure enough, Dylan went with the guy. They hopped in the car, and someone started following them everywhere they went. And Dylan said it was something like out of a movie, but it's actually happening here within Calgary, within Canada. So it is interesting. It's something we need to be aware of, certainly at every level. Why don't we start at that very hyper-local level? Melanie, tell us a little bit about, and you actually did a great job of educating us, for those who may or may not know, how your newspaper is funded, what your relationship is with the U of C and the Students' Union, and then what some of those pressures are when you're trying to provide a balanced, fair, accurate story.
So the Gauntlet is the independent student publication of the University of Calgary. We publish about 5,000 print copies weekly during the year. And we are incorporated under the Alberta Societies Act as an independent society, which means that we're funded directly by a student levy. So students pay about $4.50 or so of their student fees go towards supporting us, but we don't, the best way of phrasing it is we don't owe anything to the university or the Students' Union. We rent space from the Students' Union, and that's kind of about it. And so, but not everybody at the university knows that often, and so we've had some times where people come out and say, you know, oh, well, you're the student union paper. And it's like, no, we'll hold the Students' Union accountable for what they do, and we'll hold the university accountable for what they do, and that is our role there. And back in the 70s, actually, we were shut down very briefly and started up separate from the Students' Union, and there's a whole bunch of history with that, and it's the classic alternative student press story, where the Gauntlet was rebuilt on the sidelines, essentially, with the people who got kicked out of running it before, which is one of my favorite stories. But it's difficult for us because even we interact a lot with the university's media relations people, and they didn't even necessarily know that we weren't directly connected to the Students' Union when I met with them just a few weeks ago, which was just like, well, that's probably a good thing for you to know. And it's hard, too, because they, for example, restrict a lot of our access to sources and whatnot. So if we've had a lot of scandals at our university in the past year. Our university president was accused of compromising academic integrity by sitting on the board of a large oil corporation and things like that. And it was very difficult for us because we would try and get access to these people for interviews and whatnot, and just be given pre-written statements or just kind of shut down. And so it was very hard. People come out and accuse us of being not objective in those situations. And it's like, well, we are doing the best that we can with what we're given. And there's just working, what I've found in my time with the Gauntlet has been, there's a lot of middlemen that stop us from trying to do what we want to do. I, for example, was working on a story, and I went to go to interview the head of campus security, and I could hear him around the corner, and I could hear him tell the receptionist, oh no, I can't say this one sentence to her, she has to go through media relations. And it was like, I know you, I've talked to you before, but we are stuck with these huge barriers. And I think as an organization, that's one of the biggest things that we have to kind of work around for sure. On, again, that super hyper-local level.
Right. On that hyper-local level, I think that's reflective of what happens in a lot of North American cities. For example, at levels of municipal government, there are now at City Hall in Calgary, there are many great communications professionals there, but there are about 36 PR people, communications people, who are managing the message. And so when a reporter wants to ask somebody in a certain department a question, they're not allowed to go to that person and say, hey, what's happening with the Peace Bridge repairs, for example. They need to go to the communications department. They enter a request or put in a request, I'd like to talk to so-and-so about this issue. And that person says, okay, I'll find out who's handling that area. So then they find the communications professional who's responsible for that. That takes a couple of hours. That person eventually gets back to the reporter and says, so what do you want to talk about? The reporter restates the request. That person then goes and finds the person who we really need to talk to, and that takes a couple of hours, and eventually, if you're lucky, that person is made available at 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon, which can be very difficult for telling a fulsome story, for trying to get accountability for where all of our tax dollars are going. We see it in terms of as simple as a City Hall agenda. As you may have heard, there's an Olympic bid that is being considered right now by the City of Calgary, and as opposed to a fulsome listing on the agenda. Someone somewhere decides to put an agenda item that says something, I think it said CSTA or whatever the acronym is for Calgary Sports Tourism Authority presentation, and that's it. And so there's just a lot of people who are managing the messages, whether you're at an institution or any level of government. And again, it's not to perhaps criticize those who are doing that job. That's what their jobs are. But it's just interesting now that there are so many people who are managing the message.
And it's interesting, actually, just to add on to that a little bit, to contrast. A great example of that comes in that we're covering, as they mentioned in my bio, this ongoing lawsuit between our students' union and our administration. And the students' union doesn't have that sort of middle management, so we get half-hour, 45-minute interview, in-depth discussions with them, and then we're given like a 2-sentence pre-written statement from the university. So a lot of people come out and they're like, wow, you're not being objective, you just have this like wonderful, thoughtful answer from the students' union and this pre-written statement from the university. And it's like, well, that's, again, another interesting place just to see that in stark contrast.
Do you ever get told, don't write that story?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The university media relations person, and not so much just because we haven't had stories like that this year, but my predecessor in my job, they were basically on speed dial. Like, she would call and just be like, why did you publish this? And it's like, well, it's news. The students deserve to know the news. And the media relations person, like, we're not breaking any laws. We're very good with our libel and our slander. We're like on top of that. But they would, be told that's not a story or it's not worth publishing. And we're like, well, the students probably disagree. And so it's an interesting contrast there.
Yeah, it is. When we were talking about press freedom, and we're going to move to a sort of a wider scope, international scope here in a minute, but when press freedom at our level, in a local level, isn't there, people don't get the story. When press freedom is taken away on a much larger level, people can end up in jail. Which is, so how would, you've been back now, or you've been out of prison for about 11 months, Mohammed. How would you describe, have your thoughts about Canadian journalism changed at all? How do you describe that international experience you had to the Canadian journalistic experience?
Well, after spending 438 days in prison, I came to realize how an impeccable media community we have in Canada. They've done an unbelievable job. Everyone from the online, the TV, they were there in Egypt in the courtroom, and some of them even made it to the prison, and it was just great. And the important thing here is that a lot of people in the Middle East were not able, and journalists, to say what they really wanted to say, and some newspapers were translating Canadian press into the Middle East. And that was very interesting. Even the tweets were being translated by Canadian journalists. So that was huge, because my battle was a public relations battle and in the courtroom, and it was a huge case that involved not just press freedom, but it was also a political case between Egypt. There was a lot of vendettas between Egypt and Qatar, the owner of Al Jazeera. So I needed that kind of support. And it was interesting because I'm usually on this side of the mic. Now overnight I became the story with my colleagues, and it was hard. So controlling the media message and seeing how the Canadian press really understood the details of the case. And many of those journalists, I'm writing my book now, which is coming out in November 1, and I'm just going back through the whole experience, and I'm seeing what they were doing. The radio journalists, talking to my family and taking leads and looking at, chasing the Egyptian officials and going in and digging really deep to get the story. It was like a lifeline for me. And and in solitary confinement, where I spent over a month, very little information would come through, but my wife would smuggle in the food papers like these that are folded up, and they're pretty much printouts of the news. And I would read them and then rip them up before anyone finds them. And just reading those, knowing, wow, people in Canada are vouching for me, and I have so many people behind me, and it was just incredible. And I think that raised my morale, and it kept my spirits up, and that's how I survived, basically.
It must have been an incredibly difficult transition to go from covering the news to be the news maker.
Oh, it was hard. It was really hard, and but I in prison I never stopped being a journalist too. It was, it's not every day where you wake up in the morning and you have Al Qaeda fighters and ISIS sympathizers and people who You know, people die literally to try to get a story from them, and they're here, except we had bars between us, so that was safe. And, you know, there's just so much context about what's dominating our headlines today in terms of the terrorism and what's happening, stories I could never get outside. So that was very ironic that I had to go to prison to meet these people and live with them.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and writing it now and simplifying it in a book was a challenge, and you know, I'm glad that the book is done.
When your freedoms were taken away like that, were you frightened for your life?
Not frightened for my life, but there were very tough moments. When you're in a cell, I had a broken shoulder as well, sleeping on the floor. There was the toilet wasn't flushing. There were insects. It was freezing. Very little food. Very little interaction. Very, very extreme conditions. And you wonder, what are you going to do? How are you going to survive? You got to balance between your spiritual side, your physical side. You have to just keep thinking positive, and you know, how am I going to survive this? You're on survival mode, basically. And I'm sure many of you are wondering what you would have done if you're in the same situation. And you'll be very surprised, because you have your threshold just goes on. You know, you just find a new person in front of you. You fight it, and many people get issues and don't make it, but thankfully, or they're troubled in prison. I had a good family support system, good media support system, and everybody in Canada, I felt like there was a whole country was behind me with all these petitions that were signed and tweets. And you know, people sometimes don't realize what petitions can do, but they do make a huge difference. For example, Amnesty International, they had an amazing petition, over 90,000 people signed. Avaz had a petition going, 50,000 people signed, and so on. And Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression. We use these petitions in court to tell the judge, hey, this guy's not a terrorist, and you know, he's an innocent man. So, you know, I thank everyone who helped me.
Absolutely. Asha, when you hear a story like that, as a journalist, documentary filmmaker who is at the early stages of your career, you're traveling overseas sometimes to do your work. What do you think about press freedom when you hear these stories? Does it give you cause for concern? Does it make you think? Does it fire you up? Does it make you think, I'm going to do this? It gives you even more reason why you want to do it. How do you react when you hear these kinds of stories?
I think it's definitely inspiring, and we need to continue hearing these stories. You know, this is Mohammed's story, but how many other individuals are still behind bars today because of the stories that they were sharing? And I think it's really important that we continue this conversation. And being an independent journalist, I can tell you some of the challenges that independent journalists face in regards to, well, some of the benefits of being an independent journalist is that you have access to stories and sources that the mainstream media overlooks or doesn't cover. But the other side of it is that you have a lot of lack of support because of not having a larger media outlet behind you. So I think, you know, being an independent journalist is another challenge in itself. And what's interesting is that, you know, the way the media works is that the media impacts the way we understand the world and the way we see our place in the world. And this summer I actually was teaching journalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I was in a small town that is actually still divided since the war. So 20 years ago, the war happened, and this small town is divided. And I was teaching inside of a school building where they're actually ethnically segregated. So on one floor, you've got Bosniak Muslims learning about one side of the story, one side of the history, and then on the second floor, you have Croatians learning about the other side of the history. And the project that I was a part of actually brings the students together. And what we were looking at in my class is the danger of a single story and the importance of having different perspectives. And I think this really is a metaphor. The school building is a metaphor for freedom of press and investigative journalism, because at the end of the day, we have to dig deeper and continue to find these different perspectives. And it was interesting because this was in Bosnia, but I feel like as Canadians, we must know what's happening in other parts of the world, in other regions that are dealing with issues with press freedom and are really impacted by the way the media is in their country. So in Bosnia, for example, they have, since they're divided and the country's divided, they have 3 presidents, they have different school systems, you know, they've got different public broadcasters, different private media, and everybody is telling the story from from basically one ethnic side. So you're not getting a full picture. And I think what's important for us is to continue to get that full picture and to get that full perspective of the story. And that's where investigative journalism really plays a role. And unfortunately today, with the way the media landscape is changing, there's not a lot of investigative journalism happening. And we need more investigative journalists because there's more crime and corruption today. And I feel like it's a responsibility of large media outlets and independent media to work together, to be able to cover the ground and to really find these stories.
When you've been working as an independent filmmaker, have you found, because you don't have that backing of a large organization, has your integrity or credibility been called into question?
Credibility has been called into question, and I think that's why if any of you want to pursue journalism and to pursue independent work, it's important, to have your website, to have your work, to be able to show these individuals the stories you've covered, and that really builds trust. When I was in Italy reporting on the refugee crisis there, a lot of the refugees and migrants I was working with were very skeptical and also distrusting of the media. I actually came across an Afghan refugee who actually told me, I'm not telling you my story because you're going to be here for my story today, and then tomorrow you'll be on your next story. Well, it's still my reality. And that really made me think of my role as a journalist differently because this is how he was impacted. So I definitely found a lot of refugees in Italy at the time were very desensitized to journalists and our role. And that was something I'd never experienced before because in North America, a lot of us sometimes are very desensitized to news, negative news. And then to see these individuals who are desensitized to journalists was just surprising for me and really made me look at my role as a journalist and the impact that I really want to make. And one of the questions I had for Mohammed was actually, basically, with your time in prison, did that impact the way you look at journalism with the individuals that you met?
Yeah, sure. You don't go through an experience like this without being a changed man. So the way I'm looking at journalism now, I was covering the story globally, but there were so many angles that I wasn't really exploring in depth. And as I write today, I'm trying to really understand the difference between all these terrorist groups. And because we keep hearing terrorism, but we really have to understand these groups and how they think and where they're coming from before we can even begin to formulate how to defeat them. And it's not just about bombing these locations or these groups, it's about defeating or countering the idea itself. And that's what I hope I can expand on when in my writing or in my reporting, when I go back to reporting and try to bring a perspective from what I've gained from unfortunately living with them. But you also have to try to make it work for you. And that's what I came out from this experience as well. There was one book I read inside that really changed my perception. It was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He's an incredible man, a neurologist and a survivor of the Auschwitz, and he has a concept, that tragic optimism, and about turning a very pitiful and sad situation, saying yes when you're facing injustice and death, and turning it into a human achievement for you and others. And I think that's the motto I live with since I've been out. I've read, and it's very ironic because finally, after I was moved to a better prison, I got a stack of books from the Canadian ambassador and my family and friends, and the thinnest book was that one, and that was the most moving one for me. And I probably read it twice, and I kept talking about it all day to the prisoners and to everyone, and it's really interesting. I recommend people to read it.
Yeah.
Man's Search for Meaning. You'll find it's on the internet. I don't think you even need to buy it anymore. It's on there, and it's a really interesting book. Of course, being in the Auschwitz, reading about Auschwitz and being in prison, I felt like, whoa, I'm in Club Med now compared to that.
You've said, again, as recently as this morning, that, of course, prison changed you, and you said, hopefully for the better. Tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, my wife and mother now, you know, when I get excited, say, I'm going to go back to Libya or I'm going to go to Iraq, they're like, no, you're not. So, I mean, I spent all my career covering conflict zones, the past, you know, my 15-year-old career, and I think twice now, and, you know, I feel that I still want to continue, of course, to give voice to the voiceless and cover these stories that make a difference, and, you know, what has drawn us into journalism, but I'm trying to think of, you know, a new approach to doing it, not necessarily being on the front line, but, you know, that's how I'm thinking now. Mm-hmm. And I have a question for you. And when you go on the ground, I mean, I've been working for, you know, CNN and organizations and Al Jazeera, and when we go in, we have, you know, you have pretty much a small army with you. You have producers, you have even a security man who's a former security professional who tells you where to go and whatnot and what to do. And you have equipment and tracers and all that. But do you feel sometimes when you go on the field and you're alone that you're exposed? What do you tell your students who are probably very excited to jump right into the big story? What do you tell them?
So some of the challenges that I did face in Italy, it was my sister and I who were producing this multimedia documentary that actually maps out the life of asylum seekers from right when they land to Italy to what their life looks like 10 years down the line. And one of the challenges we faced was being female, because we were going into all of these makeshift communities. So makeshift communities are worlds that refugees create for themselves within a world that may not accept them. So a lot of them were on the outskirts of town. A lot of them were made by the refugees. They had cement walls. We actually went to a place called Salam Palace, and it's an abandoned university on the outskirts of Rome, where over 850 refugees live there. They have their own cafe. They have their own mosque. They have 2 grocery stores, an auto shop. And they just basically created this world within one that may not accept them. And they also have a council that runs the house. So being in those situations was a bit difficult, because we had to use our cultural background, because we are Somali. So we had to work with some of the Somali refugees to get access into those places. We made sure that we weren't in dangerous situations. But I feel like sometimes when you're on your own and you've got smaller equipment, and these days, you know, journalism's changing. It's becoming more accessible. Equipment is getting smaller. So you really do have the accessibility to be in these places and to really create a relationship with these individuals. And we stayed with them for a long period of time, almost a month and a half, to really gather their stories. And it was so interesting, because the camera almost became an extension of ourselves. You know, being in that situation where you've got such few equipment to work with. And I feel like that's really important, because, you know, sometimes I feel like as someone who's worked in mainstream media as well, you're kind of in and out of a story. And I always had a bad feeling about that. So when I was working with these individuals and just really telling them my intentions and the reason why I wanted to share their story, I felt like that created a lot of trust. And I feel like it was great having a small team. I think that really gets you even closer to the story you're working on.
Mm-hmm. It does raise the whole topic about digital journalism, because it is so easy for people to report, and we see that when conflicts are happening around the world now. Twitter is often where people become reporters and look at what's happening on our main street, whether it's tanks rolling into town, whether it's an army leaving, coming, going, whatever it might be, a rebel, an uprising. When it comes to digital journalism, Melanie, has that changed things on a local level that you see?
Oh, drastically. We just got Snapchat a couple months ago because we had to be hip with the kids.
Wait, aren't you the kids?
I thought I was, and then I saw my teen sister, and I was like, well, apparently the Gauntlet needs Snapchat. But yeah, no, I mean, like student press as a whole is facing basically the same problem that mainstream media is facing, which is like people don't pick up print newspapers anymore because they already read that news on Twitter. And it's like we've had to change a lot of our print cycle, for example. We used to, because the Gauntlet was kind of founded with a lot of we were training people for the traditional news cycle. You write your stories, they go into the weekly issue. And now we are moving towards a model where it's like you write your story, it goes online, because otherwise somebody else will beat you to it. And I think the way the digital works has become, especially with breaking news things, both abroad and at home, is just somebody else will beat you to it. and somebody else will beat you to it, maybe wrong, and we don't want that. And it is kind of our duty to like get it accurate and get it objective, but also get it out there fast and accessible to people. And people get their news through Twitter and Snapchat now, so we got to get with the times.
I'm an addict. I'm a Twitter addict. I mean, I need to get treatment or something.
How many tweets do you think you send out a day?
Well, you know, it's 15 maybe, but it's not bad. It's just it's not bad. It's not that bad. But I'm always reading it.
Always reading it.
Yeah, and in the past, I'd wake up and I'd look at Reuters and AP before anything else to start, focusing on where I'm going to go today. Now I'm looking at Twitter and I'm following everybody, the terrorists, the government officials, because that's how it's sort of. But of course, in time, you know who's who, and you know who's trusted and who's not, and yeah.
Yeah, it is an important part of the news cycle now. Yeah. Now, you must have found from your experience, social media played a huge role in spreading awareness, in getting people talking about your situation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the first month in prison, the hashtag that was launched, Free HSF, got about 140 million mentions or participants. And then by the time we were released, it was 5 billion. So it was huge, and we relied on using the hashtag for disseminating everything from our family press releases, and my family became experts at PR and NGO work and everything else just to get me out. And that's the advice I give, with my foundation at its infancy phase. We've started my own foundation, and I work with groups like Amnesty and Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression. But I got a lot of people and families who have their loved ones in prison who call me just to get some advice, and we have lawyers in the foundation, and we tell them, you have to use all your sources. You have to, you can't just rely on the government, and you can't just rely on your lawyers. You also have to be proactive in terms of humanizing the prisoner and making sure the stigma of terrorist or spy is not, what it's about out there. You got to change the message. The media gets really bored really quickly, as you know, and you need to keep feeding the machine. So creating hashtags and new information is very important. We created the Harper Call Egypt campaign, which got huge support and got the attention of the conservative government. They started doing a little bit more, and today I've learned stuff like the Twitter storm. So we have prisoners we're fighting for at my foundation, and we also have free press campaigners from New Zealand to Argentina, and we design a time for everyone worldwide to start tweeting and using a certain hashtag, and then it becomes a Twitter storm, and the name of the prisoner is trending on Twitter. The press gets the attention, they start writing about this person. So it's something we learned and we're applying now.
Right. The purpose of your foundation is, how would you describe it?
To advocate for journalists, free press champions, as I like to call them, and provide financial assistance. And by that I mean money to help with legal fees, money for the families to get to be able to visit their loved ones. And sometimes $1,000 is a big money when it's in Egypt or Ethiopia or other countries. So and we partner in with other organizations. We put sometimes money together, and we donate towards that cause. So that's what we do.
And education also sounds like an important part of what you're doing. What would you say about the level, since you've been back for the last 11 or so months, what would you say about the level of education of Canadians? Are we as aware as we should be? Are we missing the boat somehow? Are there some myths that we need to explode to really understand what's happening?
Well, no, my fellow Canadians here, everybody's engaged in terms of, because of the internet has made this possible. People are more engaged than I thought, let's just put it this way. But that myth that we are an ocean away and that these terrorists are not going to make it here, we can't think like that anymore. I mean, these are ideas that flow very easily through the internet, and we have to just stay very aware of how to counter ideas, that like terrorism and that dominates our headlines, that could affect all of us. And it's not just something that can be countered by our government. All of us need to have a proactive approach, a lot of awareness. And you know, I've been reading all the jihadi forums lately for my book, and you know, I'm recognizing there's a pattern. And I don't want to get much in talking about terrorism because this is about freedom of expression, but I noticed that the spokesman of ISIS, Adnani, released a statement in September 22 calling on his cadres across the world to attack foreigners, Australians, Canadians, and especially the French. That's what he said. And then he said, you know, you can use a stone, you can use your car, you can use a knife. And then I looked at the two attacks that we had in Canada against Mr. Nathan Cicilio in Ottawa. God bless him. I hope, you know, he was killed in October, 2 weeks after that message, approximately. And then we had another case in Montreal where 2 police officers were run over by a car, and 1 police officer died, the other one survived. And it seemed like, you know, and from what I've seen in prison, that, you know, some of these young Muslims who have deviated from their religion and then taken on this crazy idea are very easily inspired. They're very confused, they're easy praise. So that's why it's a very hard concept to deal with. It's fighting the idea itself, not necessarily just bombing these people on the other side of the world.
And of course, it's very interesting because we're talking about freedom of the press, which obviously I think probably everyone here values. But at the same time, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, you have people expressing these ideas, how to kill, use a stone, use a knife. I think we'd all be more comfortable if those ideas weren't being expressed. So how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it's
I don't have an answer. I don't know what the answer is, but
I think that's the biggest question.
And I just wanted to add to Mohammed's point about the power of social media, and it's so amazing to see that. You know, I saw the hashtag journalism is not a crime on Twitter everywhere, and it was so amazing just to see the amount of media attention that they were getting, and the whole world knew what was happening. And what was more amazing is the level of collaboration among journalists. And that was something that I think is increasing more and more. So a perfect example of that would be the Khadija Project. So when Khadija Ismailova was arrested in December of 2014 in Azerbaijan, she asked her colleagues to continue her work. And through that, the Khadija Project was created. So more than 20 journalists from so many different media outlets were contributing to the reporting that she would have done if she had not been arrested. And they continued that for 3 years until she was released in June, which was so amazing. And I actually met one of the organizers in Sarajevo this summer, and she's talking about how the government tried to shut Khadija down, but in return, they got this army of journalists, and I think that's so amazing, and that's something that we're going to be continuing to see in the future, is this solidarity between journalists and this idea that it's not about competition anymore, but it's about collaboration.
There is a lot more collaboration, even on a hyper-local level, and I know what I see is that when one individual organization's rights might be tramped upon, or someone is trying to put up some roadblocks, I see more and more collaboration now, whether it's CTV and Global and CBC and the Herald Sun and all getting together and fighting. A recent case was in court. There was a young boy, I think he was 14, and his parents were charged with his death in terms of not providing all the, as they call it, the necessaries of life. And this young boy ultimately starved to death. So the judge in the case decided that the evidence, the pictures, that the media shouldn't look at them. It just wasn't appropriate. And it's really, bothersome when those kinds of blocks come up. And so certainly as a group, we all got together and worked together. How are we going to get around this? How are we going to fight this? So certainly the power of many is always greater than the power of one. But as a hyper-local organization sort of sitting out by yourself way up there in the Northwest. Is there collaboration from other student newspapers across the country? Do you feel that support ever?
It's actually quite interesting. Just this summer, we actually started a Facebook group that is all the editor-in-chiefs of several of the major student newspapers across Canada. So the UBC, which is at UBC, the Varsity, which is at Toronto, ourselves, the University of Alberta, and there's about a dozen of us on there, and we basically, when big stories come up, we bounce them off, and sometimes we run stories from other papers that are like pressing and relevant. So we had some big cyber hacking going on at our university, and a few papers in Ontario were like, well, that's really relevant to us. Do you mind if we like run it with your guys' byline and link it back? And kind of a wire service, almost a makeshift wire service. And so I think that we all want to help each other out on the kind of the national scale there in terms of student press, and also learn from each other in terms of the nitty-gritty of student press, and complain about media relations, or talk about rewriting our bylaws, or talk about independence and not independence. And it's a really great forum, and I'm really glad it exists, because I think it's made our paper better, and I think it's made a lot of papers across Canada better by being able to learn from each other.
It's certainly a case of where technology does good. It's interesting, though, technology, which has given rise to this fabulous digital journalism that we all love, what's happened is we do have some giants who have come onto the scene, aggregators of news. So Google News, for example, is not sending somebody to sit through the U of C Board of Governors meeting. They're not sending somebody to sit through every court case or City Hall or whatever it is. People aggregate. They borrow news from all kinds of organizations. And in some ways, I can see where this is hurting the freedom of press, because what happens is those people are getting lots of eyeballs. Those people get advertisers. Those people get revenue. Revenue shrinks for outlets that are sending people at all of those things. The more revenue shrinks, budgets shrink, there's fewer reporters. So I can see how some of the digitalization of media isn't necessarily having a great impact. Do you notice, you've been in the news business for a number of years, a couple of decades or more, are the number of foreign correspondents, the organizations that can afford to send people overseas, is that shrinking?
Oh, totally. I mean, the budgets are everywhere in the world. It's much harder now for organizations to cover the news, and that's why they're relying more on freelancers that don't require insurance, and that's something I don't like at all, because I've seen freelancers who are really good young journalists who really want to get the story at the front line end up in places like Syria, and they're exploited by organizations who, oh, okay, you're there, okay, why don't you send us a story, you know, and to me that's very dangerous, and we've seen people who were killed and captured, as you know.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them was Stephen Sotloff, for example, and who was an American Jewish journalist, and he was a friend of mine, and he was captured in Syria, and he was beheaded by ISIS, and that's pretty much started the huge coalition bombing, or escalated the bombing in Syria. And I always tell, I lecture at University of British Columbia, and many of the students, I tell them that, you can be the best journalist in the world, but if you don't have, some good hostile environment training, a little bit of linguistic skills, and, the ability to maneuver safely on the ground, you may not be able to file the story or take it back home. So these are very, very important issues that, you can't just barge in and do that story. Big organizations have a big responsibility not to exploit that, and that's something I'm always very strongly expressing.
Asha, do you ever feel taken advantage of in terms of, do you think, well, it would be nice if I worked for a TV station and they were giving me a salary of this and I could go in and do the stories? Instead, you've got to go in on your own with your sister. You're your own backup. You're your own crew. You sell a story then for a certain amount of money. How does that sit with you?
I think what's interesting is that, as someone who's also worked in mainstream media with CBC and just seeing how things work, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to cover stories that need to be told. There's more freedom that you have when you're doing independent journalism. But then the downfall of that is not having support and not having support financially as well, being funded to do these projects. And I think that's a dilemma that a lot of people have. And as the media landscape is changing, we're seeing so many more smaller organizations, smaller news agencies that are coming up, and these kind of new different storytellers in regards to people trying to tell these stories. So it is getting harder to navigate this landscape, but I think now there's so much more opportunity to take our stories to the next level with the access to technology that we have, and also being able to really connect with other storytellers. And I think what's interesting is that today, a lot of people are beginning to tell their own stories, from academics to activists, NGOs to the governments. People are creating their own media, and it's so interesting just to see NGOs who are producing such amazing investigative journalism and independent journalism just because of the funding they have as well. So there's definitely some positives and negatives to it, but I always like to focus on the positive side. And if you work hard to share these underreported stories, then you're going to create change, and hopefully that'll make a difference in the world.
It's an excellent answer. What about, and you spoke about this earlier too, giving voices to some of the untold stories, because you're absolutely right. There are millions of stories in the world that should be told and need to be told, and media can only tell so many. Do you think there's ever a time when the media shouldn't be telling a story, in terms of, like, when someone came up to you and said, you're going to be gone tomorrow? Like, do you ever worry about telling a story, what the repercussions are the next day, someone's security, someone's safety? Is that something that plays a lot into what you do?
Definitely. That's something that I tend to focus on when I'm going out to get these stories. I'm very sensitive and also culturally sensitive. A lot of the stories I report on have to do with minorities. And one of the films I actually worked on, it was a documentary film that was in Alberta, and it was about immigrant women and breast cancer, and really looking at breast cancer advertisements in Canada and how they show mostly Caucasian women. So when ethnic women see these photos, they don't see their face, therefore they don't see their story. And a lot of them believe that breast cancer won't happen to them. And then they find out at the latest stage. And to work on a project like that, where these women are, behind closed doors, and it's a silent issue because of cultural stigmas and because of sensitivities, it took about 6 months to get an interview with these women. So I think it's really important to really create a space where you continue to work on the story. And I think that's where investigative journalism really plays a part in digging deeper and finding these different perspectives and really connecting with those stories.
Yeah, I mean, this concept is a major problem. I mean, the Freedom House has released a statistic that only 14% of the world enjoys freedom of expression. In countries like war-torn countries, there's something that happens there is that sometimes they don't want stories that will expose the military and affect the morale of the soldiers. And there's this hyper-nationalistic atmosphere everywhere. And you think 3-4 times before you press that send button on you, thinking that this is gonna come back to haunt me. And I used to think like that in many places and many others, and eventually the knock came on the door. But it's something that we may not have dealt with in Canada here, but when in these governments and if in history, when you read it's been repeated in many countries like Russia and Vietnam during the war, and there's always this unit somewhere in the government telling you, take it easy on this part, and it's the biggest challenge basically between and that's why it's harder for journalists to cover sometimes their own backyard when it comes to that level.
What about when it comes to working with a whistleblower? The Snowden case was a big one, of course, where all the media were talking about what Snowden had to say. But whistleblowers, good for journalism, bad for journalism?
I mean, I think it's good for journalism. It's very important, especially if it's for a good cause and it's not just a revenge or something that's fueled by the wrong motives. And WikiLeaks is a very interesting project. We're seeing it being used as a weapon now in the American elections. And it's a very sensitive topic.
Yeah. We're going to just take a couple more minutes here and wrap up this part of the panel, and then we'll open up to the very many excellent questions that some of you have. So let's just end this part of the conversation by talking about the future of journalism when it comes to press freedom. Where do you see things at a hyper-local level, Melanie?
Ooh. Hopefully just on a good trajectory towards more. I think in terms of student press, it's interesting because we're often viewed as like such an alternative media that either we're not taken seriously or we're only taken seriously for like a branch of something else and whatnot. And at least in the terms of university papers and whatnot, I think that it's very important. And it's not more important than it is on an international scale, but for journalists who are just starting off and who are in J school or who are like me working at these smaller papers and whatnot, you'll get discouraged if you don't have that here, and then you won't ever be able to go and do the important groundbreaking work. And so like this is kind of a microcosm model of what the real world is like. And so I think it's very important to have that freedom at this level so that you can appreciate that freedom at like a greater level.
Right. In Canadian cities, I think we're pretty lucky as well because every province has freedom of information legislation, which is great. And as a upbeat note for those of us in Calgary, there's an exercise that a group called Newspapers Canada does pretty well every year. And what they do is they get a reporter at all the major, or many of the major newspapers across the country to try to find out the same kind of information through a FOIP request. And so recently we were asked, as was a lot of other major newspapers in Canada, to FOIP the police and ask them questions about overtime and various things. And then we all report back how long did it take, what roadblocks were there. And the City of Calgary and police service here actually got an A in that event. So even though it might not be the information they want to share, we have laws that protect the sharing of that information, and I was really pleased to see that in a couple of cities much further east, the police service wanted to argue that this didn't apply to them and they didn't have to share the information. But in Calgary, they got an A. So I'm hopeful for the future of press freedom, and I think there's a lot of good things happening on this trajectory. But I think what's really important is that while things might be going well here, that we really don't ever forget about the importance of international news and what's happening around the world, because as one of you said, it's no longer an ocean away. So maybe, Asha, you can give me a final thought on what you think about the future of press freedom.
I feel like the future is collaboration. I attended one of the biggest media festivals last April in Italy, and I actually found out about this project. It's called Press Starts, and it's the first global crowdfunding project that actually supports journalists in countries where the press can't report freely. And it's amazing, now people can fundraise for these individuals who are talented and influential journalists to be able to report in their countries that, are in poverty and they really don't have a lot of access to resources. So I think, as journalists, we're responsible for supporting these organizations, but I think, as the audience, as our communities, as our news consumers, you also have the responsibility to really support these independent journalists and to really support their projects and to seek out these stories, because at the end of the day, everyone's trying to work hard to inform you all to make better decisions about your society and the world we live in.
Mohammed, over to you when we talk about the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm very happy that we have a liberal government now that really respects. Just speaking for people at CBC, and the budgets are much higher now, and life is much easier. Everybody's happier. I believe that I've visited Ottawa. I've met the Prime Minister and Mr. Dion, the Foreign Minister, and members of the Parliament, and we are so lucky with what we have at the moment, and I think it's only going to get better. And then if it doesn't, then we do what we do, right? Take them accountable for it. But before we go off, since we're on TV and you're all here. You know, there's a Canadian-Iranian woman now in Iran. Her name is Huma Hutvar. She's a professor in Concordia, an anthropologist, an excellent researcher, and she's detained in Iran on fabricated charges for the past 3 months. And so many people are trying to free this woman, who's obviously innocent, and I've been in contact with her family, and there's so many people who are behind her, and there's no stigmas of any kind that she would even begin to be on the wrong side in any way. So she's someone I hope we can just try to keep her story alive, and I hope she returns back home.
Thank you for raising that excellent point. The talented Brian is here to moderate the Q&A.
All right, so thank you once again for that riveting panel discussion. So please give it up for your panel and your moderator. One last time. Hello. Amazing, amazing. Okay, so for the Q&A, we do have a bit of ground rules. You can find our mic runners in the aisle right now. Please sort of meet them halfway, sort of come towards them. Please do not touch the microphone. They will hold it for you, as well as keep your questions to within 20 to 30 seconds. If you have a story or something elaborate like that, please stay for the reception and share it with us. We would love to hear it and have that face-to-face conversation with you. As well as if you do have something to say about today's session or about future sessions that you'd like to see, please come see our volunteers. And inside of your program, you should have a survey as well. You can complete that in the foyer and pass it off to one of the volunteers for collection. Those surveys are very important because they tell us how to best serve our community, how to best serve you, and how to best create the programming that we want to create, we want the community to need. So without further ado, let's start off our Q&A. So who would like to go first? Is there someone over there? Okay.
I'm not supposed to touch this, right? So you just have to come up. I'm sorry, we're all over it. Maybe I can just come out a little bit. So a question either for Asha or for Mohammed. What advice could you possibly give to journalists in non-democratic countries? Because your job is to hold people to account. The consequences in a democratic country like Canada is, okay, somebody's going to lose the next election. But in a non-democratic country, besides worrying about your own personal consequences of what might happen, you're also looking at a situation where you may be creating blood in the streets. You never have a perfect situation in life, but if you put enough criticism on the powers that be, possibly the only alternative is bloody revolution. What advice would you give the journalist as to this terrible moral burden that they carry?
Want me to go? Yeah. I mean, my job as a journalist is not to be an agent promoting democracy. And some journalists fall into this trap sometimes. And my intentions of reporting the story is not to fuel any sort of sentiment. I tell the story from both sides. So in the many years I've been reporting in undemocratic countries or cosmetically democratic countries, I still had to say the story, no matter how bad it got on the ground. And my colleagues do, most of them, and it's a very hard decision to keep going and going and going and not worry about yourself. But that's what I was just saying. Sometimes I think 3 or 4 times before I press that button because you've angered this minister or that president or that intelligence officer and so on, or you're critiquing their work. But you still got to do it. That's what you do as a journalist. And if you don't want to do that, then you're in the wrong business. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, my name is Hassan Shirazi. I guess my question was about this Islamic State. It's supposed to be Islamic State, but they're killing more Muslim than anybody else. In fact, a few months ago, I almost got blown up too. So who is financing them? And there are major countries like Russia and America and France and everybody, Pakistani government, they are spending billions of dollars to catch them or control them, but they still keep coming and bombing and all those things. So who's financing them? How they are so strong organization? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy that you're here to ask this question. Thank you. I mean, that's great news. Well, ISIS they've taken over oil fields. They actually, it's very ironic. They sell a lot of this oil and make millions and millions of dollars, and they sell it to the Turkish government, for example. They sell it to other governments, and ironically, they sell it to Bashar al-Assad's government too. So it's a very complicated situation over there. They also depend on kidnapping and getting ransom money. They depend on getting, they actually virtually have an Islamic state in their self-prescribed capital, Raqqa, in Syria, and they take taxes from the people, and that's how they finance. At least that's what I know about. There may be more ways for them to make money. Unfortunately, it's a very tough situation for many governments, and sometimes even the governments like the US and other governments who've given the rebels and the opposition weapons, they got into the hands of ISIS. So it's very messy on the ground. And if you follow the news and the threads, ISIS was basically, came out of the womb of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, first as ISI in 2006, and then they moved and expanded their territory. They're more about expanding and getting territory, and we can say they have control over 3 million people now, and they have their own currency, and they have their own people and the system on the ground. And when I say 3 million, I say the territory between Iraq and Syria. And basically, it's in 2013 they became ISIS, and then in 2014 the leader of ISIS announced himself as a caliphate, who is the one supreme leader, and there's no recognition of any boundaries or borders as we know it. So it's a crazy concept, like I said, and it's the idea of the caliphate and the Islamic State that we should be fighting, not just bombing people. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I guess I'm not totally convinced because one thing is that Russia, America, government of Pakistan and Syria and all, they are trying to kill them. I mean, how come they can't get the leader of this group? And there is a very strong correlation between what is happening in the world, and after 9/11, this whole thing started. So there is some correlation there.
Well, Mr. Trump on the other side of the world thinks he has all the answers, and he says that Mr. Obama and Ms. Hillary founded ISIS. I mean, that's not true in the sense that they founded ISIS, but after 9/11, we know what happened, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, and the presence of the American government in Iraq was the mismanagement that led to the security vacuum after the toppling of Saddam was a fermenting and created this hub that was just incredible to deal with. And all these groups just even emerged much stronger, much more financed. Many of the soldiers in the Iraqi army that was disbanded joined these groups, some of them for ideological reasons, some of them just to make some money. And so it is a very complex situation, but what we're looking at here now with this very crazy group called ISIS has killed 90% of their victims are Muslims, actually, just by the way. And so, so there you go. It's a phenomena, and we all have to continue to speak against it.
Okay.
We have time for one last question, so Jason, pick your favorite, I guess.
Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Walker, and first of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming out and giving of your time. Mr. Mohammed Fahmy, I'm really grateful to, you're one of the petition people that I've actually signed, so now I will continue to sign petitions.
You're the reason why I'm free.
Hey,
there you go.
It was last minute, sure that made it, right? So grateful that you're all here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, really.
Yeah, no, and we are grateful, and really glad that came through my Facebook, so thank God for Facebook.
Yeah.
So while we have been talking around the global awareness, being a local activist in this part of the world, as an Indigenous woman who lives here, who's actually been called a terrorist, and CSIS is often referred to, I'm getting there, buddy, as CSIS is often referred to, I don't know more, and those of us as low-level eco-terrorists. How can you, all of you in your world, help to support the good work that people on the ground are doing, the warriors that are standing up, the warriors that are protecting our land and our water and all of that? So how can you support us? Thank you.
Honestly, at my foundation, we try to explore issues such as that. And on a local level, I believe that just like what we're doing with my campaign, just raising more awareness and getting people, I have volunteers who come in and they want to write about topics that are kind of foreign to me. And the issue of Indigenous people is huge, and I haven't done much reporting on it. You probably have done more reporting, and you're more aware of what that entails and what has been done and what should be done. I'm just getting my head around this issue, which I feel very strongly about. So maybe you can answer that.
Thank you so much for asking that question. And it's so interesting. It reminds me of a story that I was actually working on, and it was about Indigenous youth in Alberta and what it's like for them to leave the reserve and to come to the city. And really how it's really interesting because in Calgary, there's separate, there's reserve funding and then there's city funding. So there's no like transition program or funding to actually help these young people transition properly. No, at all. So it was so interesting because I was interviewing an Aboriginal man, and then he asked me, "Are you part Aboriginal?" And I was like, "No, why?" And he said, "Why else would you be interested in my story?" And I think that is where the issue is. When our mainstream media outlets here in Calgary are not covering those issues, we need to talk about the underreported stories in our own communities and really dig deeper and to work with the community to shed light on this because at the end of the day we're all journalists. We want to give a voice to the voiceless, but in order to change things we need to talk about these stories and to really bring the communities together to share their stories, to share stories that heal, stories of hope. There's so many positive stories in the Indigenous community that I know about in Calgary. So I think that's really where it starts for journalists and storytellers here to begin telling those stories. Yeah.
All right.
We have the gentleman here, just if you don't mind, Brian.
Okay.
I'll make it
One
quick,
last
Brian.
question.
One last.
I had a detailed question for the moderator, but you brought up whistleblowers, and I'm going to talk to each one of you at the end. Rio Olympics, before the Olympics took place, there was a whistleblower in Russia. It was a woman who talked about the drug scandal. And the story got out, and they were talking about should they ban the team. But this woman wanted to participate under a neutral flag in Rio. She was denied as an athlete. They invited her there as a spectator. I would just like to get your comments about that whole story. Someone who put their reputation on the line, tried to do the right thing, but has been denied being able to participate in the Olympics we are watching currently. If any of you would like to address that situation.
I think it would be tragic for that individual. And I think what's interesting, one of the best stories out of the Olympics this year have been the people who are competing under the flag of no country. The refugees, the people from a variety of countries, Russia, Somalia, Bosnia, the heroics that those people go through to get to where they are, to train, to get there. I think that by far is the most important story out of these Olympics.
Hashtag Team Refugees. She's the Syrian woman you wanted to mention as well, or somebody mentioned the name, that she survived. She was on one of the boats, and she survived by swimming, and now she's in the Olympics, and it's just an incredible story.
Perfect. Okay. So on that note, with ending with that Q&A, I'd like to pass it over to our moderators and our panelists for one last sort of closing statement or parting shot on today on World Press Freedom.
I'm honored to have shared the panel space with these fine folks here, and I, as a Calgarian, I'm really proud when I see the number of people who come out on an August afternoon when you're either busy at work or other people are on summer holidays, that you make the effort to come here and engage and ask questions and listen. I'm humbled by that, so thank you all for being there.
I want to say that since I've been back, I've been seeing Canada from my wife's eyes, and she's never been to the West or to Canada. So when she landed here, she was so excited, and she was like, "Oh, I can't believe this. There are Sikhs, there are Jewish people with the kippas, there are Jamaican Rastafarians, there are Arabs. How is this system working?" And I tell her, "Well, there you go. I've been trying to tell you about it for many years." And we have one of the safest countries in the world. I've been traveling not just to the Middle East, even in Paris and other countries in the States, and we seem to be doing something right. And this is something we should all really value. We have a country that is, a very, very prominent country, and people back in the other side of the world, they envy us for what we have. So, we should keep it.
Sure, Melanie?
Thank you all for coming again, and I think we definitely have to continue this conversation, whether it's through events like the Global Human Rights Forum or on social media. And I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes that actually has driven a lot of my work. It's by M.K. Asante. "When you make an observation, you have an obligation." And this doesn't apply to just journalists and storytellers, but the community and the audience as well, in regards to looking for stories and supporting underreported stories and independent journalists. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank everybody up here for the wonderful opportunity it was to speak on this panel and kind of be able to contrast my experiences with that broader global perspective. And I think that I've learned a lot from this, and I think the audience has learned a lot from this, and I'm really excited to see where the future of journalism goes. It's bright.
My name is Brian Francisco. I am program manager of GlobalFest, and this has been day 3 of the GlobalFest Human Rights Forum, Freedom of the Press, the local, national, and international perspective. So thank you to our in-theater audience for showing up, and have a great day. Thank you.